Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into a huge slice of history, looking at Europe from, well, the deep freeze of the Cold War, right through the Soviet collapse and up to the trends that are still shaping things now.
Yeah, it's quite a ride. So much tension, so many massive changes. We've got quite a stack of sources here, notes, research, basically our roadmap to try and pull out the key stuff, maybe some surprises too.
Exactly. The mission is to navigate all that complexity. A world split down the middle by ideology, decades of standoff, and then boom, total transformation. So let's jump right in.
Okay, so the core of it all, right? Our sources really frame this as a fundamental clash. U.S. and Western Europe on one side, Soviet Union and Eastern Europe on the other. And it wasn't just about armies or weapons. It was about how the world should work. Capitalism versus socialism. This one's better.
And the sources lay out those two systems pretty starkly. For the USSR and Eastern Europe, you've got socialist economics, totalitarian government. Remember, the Soviets expanded after World War II, basically keeping control of places they liberated from the Nazis.
Right, like Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria.
All under Moscow's thumb, especially early on with Stalin. Life was dictated by things like collectivized farms, those rigid five-year plans. Not much focus on, stuff for people to actually buy.
Very different from the West. Western Europe and the U.S. capitalist economies, democratic governments, countries running themselves, and their foreign policy, driven by that key U.S. idea, containment.
Containment. Explain that a bit more
Yeah.
based on the sources.
Well, it was essentially the U.S.-led Western effort to limit Soviet expansion, stop the spread of Soviet power, Soviet ideas. Not necessarily trying to roll it back where it already was, but just draw a line, keep it boxed in.
Okay, and that ideological fight really played out in the economy, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You see it crystal clear with the Marshall Plan. The sources describe this huge U.S. aid program, something like $13 billion back then, which is, what, a $250 billion today, to rebuild Europe after the war.
And the key thing the sources say is that it was mostly a gift, right?
Yeah.
Not loans they had to pay back.
Exactly. And that wasn't just generosity. The thinking, according to the sources, was strategic. Poverty breeds instability, maybe makes socialism look good. So make Western Europe prosperous, rebuild it with capitalism, and you remove that appeal. It was containment using economic power.
Clever. So what would the Eastern equivalent?
That was Comecon, the Council of Mutual Economic Cooperation. But the sources show it worked very differently. Resources tended to flow into the USSR, and the focus stayed on those 5-year plans, collectivized farms, again, very little focus on consumer goods for ordinary people.
You can really see that divide on those old GDP maps, can't you?
Definitely. The sources point to maps showing GDP per capita, basically, how much stuff was produced per person. Much higher numbers in the West, where the Marshall Plan money was flowing.
And you can literally see the dollar signs on the map for the Marshall Plan countries, but not for places like Czechoslovakia or Hungary. It's a really clear picture of that economic split.
So with the continent divided like this, ideologically, economically, clashes were inevitable. And one of the first really big ones was in Berlin.
Right, the Berlin airlift. 1948-49, such a strange situation. West Berlin, this little island of American, British, French zones, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany.
Yeah, people living technically in East Germany, but supplied and aligned with the West. Our sources even mention Stalin apparently called West Berlin the testicles of the West, a sensitive spot he could squeeze.
Charming. So his move was the blockade in 48.
Yep, June 1948, blocked all road and rail access, cut off 3 million people. The West had a choice. Give up the city or figure something else out. And Truman, the sources say, was adamant they weren't leaving.
Which led to the airlift. Just fly everything in.
Everything. Food, clothes, coal for fuel, every single thing needed. Pitched as humanitarian, but also, like you said, incredibly clever. It bypassed the blockade completely without a fight.
And the sheer scale of it.
Yep.
It went on for almost a year, didn't it?
It did. And there's that amazing detail in the sources about Easter Sunday, 1949. Just to show they could, a plane landed in West Berlin every minute for 24 hours straight.
Wow. 1,440 flights. That's sending a message.
It was an American flex, as one source puts it, basically saying, we can do this forever, cost is no object, you want to shoot down a plane, you start World War III.
So Stalin eventually backed down.
He did, reopened the roads in May 49. But the crisis cemented the division. Soon after, you get the formal creation of West Germany and East Germany.
And this whole situation, this deep mistrust, led straight to the big military alliances, right?
Exactly. On the Western side, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Collective security, an attack on one is an attack on all.
And the Soviets responded with the Warsaw Pact. Same idea, but for the Eastern Bloc, led by Moscow. Locked everyone into armed camps.
Right. And it's interesting, the sources note how NATO has changed over time, expanded. You see maps showing new members joining, even recently, like Finland becoming the 31st member. Reflects how things keep shifting.
Okay, so after Stalin dies, things change a bit in the Soviet Union. We get Nikita Khrushchev.
Yeah, Khrushchev definitely seemed different from Stalin, who was, grumpy, paranoid, incredibly brutal. Khrushchev talked about de-Stalinization.
What did that mean, according to the sources?
It sounded promising, at least to the West. Hints that maybe countries in the Soviet sphere could have more say, maybe even leave if they wanted. He talked about peaceful coexistence, thought socialism would win out eventually just by being better, not through war.
Then came Hungary in 1956.
Reality check time. The Hungarians took Khrushchev at his word, tried to shake off Soviet control, reached out to the UN, the U.S.
And the U.S. response.
The sources say the U.S. basically stayed out, worried about starting a bigger war. They left them on red, as one source puts it. So Khrushchev sent in the tanks, crushed the revolt, showed that promise of freedom wasn't real.
A brutal lesson. Then there was that famous kitchen debate.
Right, 1959, Nixon and Khrushchev at a World's Fair in Moscow. Soviets show off space tech, military stuff.
And the Americans show a kitchen.
A typical American kitchen, full of appliances, ovens, toasters, blenders, TVs. The subtle message, the sources say, was, this is average life in America. A dig at the lack of consumer goods in the USSR. Make people envious.
And the flow of people out of the East was a problem, especially through Berlin.
A huge problem. A brain drain, the sources call it. West Berlin was like a portal out of the Soviet sphere. So in 1961, they built the Berlin Wall.
Not to keep West Berliners out, but to keep East Germans in.
Exactly. Stop the best and brightest from leaving. And the sources talk about the risks people took trying to cross, getting shot, tunnel escapes, harrowing stuff, sadly familiar even today in some places.
Then came perhaps the most dangerous moment. The Cuban Missile Crisis.
October 1962, yeah. Fidel Castro's revolution put a socialist Cuba right on America's doorstep, 90 miles away.
And the U.S. found missile sites.
They did. Believed the Soviets were putting nuclear missiles there, capable of hitting millions of Americans. Kennedy went public, announced a naval blockade around Cuba. Tensions sky high, everyone watching those Soviet ships approach.
But the sources mentioned something discovered later, something even scarier.
Yeah, this is wild. Decades later, 1992, Castro himself apparently revealed there were already about 24 nuclear warheads on the island during the crisis. The U.S. didn't know at the time.
Wow. That changes everything.
It really does. Castro even claimed he told Khrushchev to use them if the U.S. invaded, even if Cuba was destroyed, for the sake of destroying capitalism. A truly chilling perspective.
So those 13 days were even closer to the edge than people realize. Threats flying back and forth. U.S. threatening invasion. Soviets threatening U.S. allies.
A terrifying game of chicken. But Kennedy and Khrushchev did manage to communicate, work out a deal.
What was the deal?
Publicly, Soviets pulled the missiles out of Cuba. Secretly, the U.S. agreed to pull its Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, which were pointed at the USSR.
But Kennedy didn't mention the Turkey part publicly.
No. The sources say he presented it as the Soviets backing down, a U.S. victory. Made him look strong, but it was actually a trade-off.
And this didn't go down well back in Moscow.
Apparently not. The Soviet leadership felt Khrushchev got played, looked weak. It contributed to him being removed from power not long after.
And his replacement was Leonid Brezhnev.
Brezhnev, yeah. Famous for his eyebrows. He was in charge from 64 to 82. The sources paint him as more of a return to a traditional, maybe even stagnant, Soviet style, doubling down on Russianness, keeping the communist world order intact.
Okay, so while all that drama was unfolding, what was life like in Western Europe during this period? It sounds quite different.
Oh, vastly different. A major theme in the sources is the rising standard of living, this idea of the state caring for you, cradle to grave, free healthcare, free education, childcare.
Free university, even postgrad. Plus things like 6 weeks paid vacation, shorter work weeks sometimes.
Exactly. It offered a different kind of life, maybe more security, a focus on a complete life, as one source puts it, maybe less intense work pressure than in the U.S.
But the trade-off was higher taxes.
Definitely higher taxes than in the U.S. to pay for all that. A different social bargain.
And economically, they weren't just rebuilding, they were integrating, right?
Yes, step by step. Started with things like the coal and steel community, often driven by Christian Democrat parties. Then the Common Market in 57, free trade, free movement of people.
Which eventually grew into the European Union.
Right, the EU. A massive trade bloc, second biggest in the world. The sources argued this integration was crucial for Europe to compete globally against the US and the Soviets.
And all this prosperity led to a consumer boom.
Big time. People started buying things, maybe influenced by America, maybe just having more money. Credit cards became common. Car ownership exploded, like 5 million cars in 46 to 40 million 20 years later.
Cars as a symbol of freedom.
For sure. And phones, washing machines, vacuums, things we see as normal now, but they were huge changes back then. Sources note Europeans stopped emigrating to the U.S. so much because life at home was getting pretty good.
And intellectually, socially, lots was happening too.
Yeah, a real ferment. You had existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre saying, no universal values, you make your own meaning.
The Catholic Church was changing too.
Trying to adapt. The Second Vatican Council brought changes like Mass in local languages, not just Latin, trying to stay relevant as fewer people went to church.
And feminism.
A major force, second wave feminism, building on ideas for people like Simone de Beauvoir. Big push for reproductive rights, birth control, abortion access in the 60s.
And we start seeing more women in power.
Yes, that trend begins here. People like Margaret Thatcher in the UK. She was also notable, the sources say, for starting to push back against the huge welfare state, but she became an early model for female leaders across Europe.
Culturally, music was huge.
Oh yeah, the British invasion, the Beatles, Queen, the Stones, the Who. Rock and roll became this global language, even a protest language. Sources mention illegal tapes circulating in the East.
And art.
Abstract expressionism was big, breaking away from traditional forms. Artists like Jackson Pollock, those paint splatters focusing on the act of creation. Rothko with his big blocks of color. De Kooning. The sources say knowing those names is important for the era.
Hollywood's influence too?
Definitely. Europeans got this image of Americans from films. James Dean, the cool rebel, his death kind of cemented that image.
And economically, that idea of borrowing to spend was still around.
Keynesian economics, deficit spending. Yeah,
Yeah.
Popular after the war in the West. Governments borrowing against the future to rebuild and grow.
Okay, let's shift back east. The 1980s bring another big change in Soviet leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev, yeah. Takes over in 85. The sources stress the context. The Soviet Union was basically broke, couldn't afford the arms race, couldn't afford to prop up Eastern Europe anymore.
So he tries reforms.
Big time. Several key ones. Glasnost openness, allowing criticism, trying to make Russia seem more Western. The sources actually connect this to earlier Russian leaders who tried Westernizing, like Peter the Great, and how that often caused backlash.
He also pushed for détente, better relations with the U.S.
Right, but again, largely for financial reasons, the sources suggest. They just couldn't keep up spending-wise.
And he allowed more democratic elections.
He did, multi-party elections. And the result, according to the sources, was a shock. People across the Soviet Union and the satellite states had no interest in socialist parties. They got absolutely hammered.
Then there was perestroika.
Economic restructuring, trying to introduce free market elements, make things people wanted to buy. Basically trying capitalism a lit.
And crucially, he promised not to interfere in Eastern Europe.
Yes, pledged non-intervention. And this, the sources say, was his fatal miscalculation.
How so?
He seemed to think that if he offered a nicer, less controlling version of Soviet influence, they'd want to stay connected. But the sources are clear, he was totally wrong. After 40-plus years, they just wanted out. Completely.
And once that door opened,
they bolted. The sources show how fast it happened. Poland went first. Romania's transition was the bloodiest. East and West Germany started reunifying almost immediately. The whole Soviet sphere just evaporated.
and the USSR itself broke apart.
Yep. It wasn't just the satellites leaving the bloc. The Soviet Union itself, Russia, plus those 14 other republics like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, the Baltics, they all wanted independence too. So the USSR dissolved into 15 separate countries.
So let's focus on Russia, the biggest piece left. That transition must have been incredibly tough.
Brutal. Imagine going from total state-control socialism to private ownership capitalism almost overnight. Chaos.
And the attempt to give people ownership, privatization, didn't really work out for most.
Not at all. The sources explain how the insiders, the people already in power in the dying Soviet system, basically grabbed the valuable industries for themselves just before the changeover.
People like Putin,
Exactly. Putin, for instance, ended up controlling vast oil and gas assets, becoming massively rich very quickly. These became the oligarchs. It created this tiny, super wealthy elite and left very little for the average Russian. It shaped everything that came after.
The first elected leader of this new Russia was Boris Yeltsin.
Yeltsin, yeah, 1991 to 99. The sources describe him as quite a character, a goofball. Loud, often seen drunk, but charismatic in his way. There's mention of some odd videos of him.
But his election was significant because it was actually democratic.
Crucially, yes. The sources emphasize this because Russian elections under Putin now are widely seen as illegitimate. Opponents disappear or end up dead. Putin always wins. So Yeltsin's election, however flawed he might have been, was a moment of genuine democracy.
Then comes Putin, dominating for what, nearly 25 years?
Pretty much. And under him, the sources note a steady decline in democratic processes. Rigged elections, opposition crushed. Very hard to remove. Some Russians might like him as a symbol of restoring Russian pride, but sources suggest life for many isn't great. Bad roads, schools, healthcare. There's concern about what happens after Putin.
And Russia started being aggressive towards its neighbors pretty quickly.
Almost immediately, yeah. Not just Ukraine recently. The sources mentioned earlier examples like Georgia, Belarus becoming a puppet state, pressure on the Baltic countries. It's been a pattern.
While Russia was finding its feet, another tragedy unfolded from the collapse of communism. Yugoslavia.
Right. Yugoslavia, that multi-ethnic state created after World War I, just disintegrated in the 1990s. Intense nationalism flared up. Bosnia, Slovenia, Croatia, they all wanted their own countries.
And it led to ethnic cleansing.
Horrifically, yes. Primarily carried out by Serbia, using the old Yugoslav army. The sources detail the systematic targeting of ethnic groups in Bosnia, trying to wipe them out or drive them away.
There was a specific demographic targeted, wasn't there?
Chillingly, yes. The sources highlight the focus on killing young men, roughly 15 to 35. It was a brutal tactic to eliminate potential fighters and cripple the ability of those communities to resist.
Okay, zooming out to Europe more broadly over the last 20 years or so, what major trends do the sources point to?
One big one is immigration and the resulting cultural clashes. People arriving from former colonies, the sources often use Algerians and France as an example. Different languages, religions, customs. This creates tension, with some native Europeans feeling their cultures being threatened.
And this has fueled the rise of far-right parties.
Definitely. It's become much more prevalent. Parties like the National Front in France, Orban in Hungary, they've gained a lot of ground. Their message, as the sources describe it, is often about assimilation. Learn the language, adopt the culture, become like us.
Europe still struggles with outside influence, too.
Seems so. The sources suggest it's hard to escape the gravity of the U.S. and Russia. Russia often seen as a threat, the U.S. maybe as a defender or economic partner, but both having a huge impact.
But there's also a strong green movement.
Very strong in Europe. Environmental parties have real power, more than in the U.S., often because Europe's multi-party systems let them win seats in parliament and influence policy directly.
And that trend of female leaders we mentioned earlier.
That's continued and become quite widespread. Building on figures like Thatcher, maps in the sources show lots of European countries have had at least one female head of state now.
Wow. So much ground covered. It really is an incredible arc of history.
It really is, from that rigid bipolar Cold War world
Through the shock of the collapse, the difficult transitions, the conflicts.
to the Europe we see today, still grappling with nationalism, immigration, the environment, the long shadow of history, and those big external powers.
And understanding that journey, all those twists and turns we pulled from the sources, it really helps make sense of current events, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You see the roots of today's issues.
Absolutely. History isn't over. It's constantly shaping what's happening right now.
Okay, so reflecting on everything we've discussed, the ideological clash, the economic strategies, the Berlin crises, Cuba, the differences in life, East and West, Gorbachev's gamble, the messy aftermath, Yugoslavia, the recent trends. Here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Given all this, how do those deep tensions between national identity and globalization, between cultural anxieties and the basic need for economic security, how do they continue to play out in Europe today? And what lessons, if any, can we draw from the Cold War's battles and consequences that still feel relevant now?
Definitely a lot to chew on there.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.